Picture this. It's 1245, University of Paris. You're standing in what medieval people called the ultimate intellectual battlefield. This isn't some quiet classroom. This is a verbal gladiator arena where reputations are built and destroyed in a single debate. The air is thick with tension as students and masters gather in a circle, waiting for blood. And there, on a wooden bench that seems too small for his massive frame, sits this giant of a man, 6 feet tall in an age when most men barely reach 5'4", shoulders that could carry ox yokes, hands like dinner plates. But here's the thing, he never speaks. Week after week, while brilliant minds around him clash in fierce intellectual combat, this mountain of a man just sits there, silent, listening, thinking. His classmates have given him a nickname that cuts deep in this world where quick wit means survival: the dumb ox. In medieval universities, that's not just mockery, it's an intellectual death sentence. Because if you can't debate, if you can't think on your feet, if you can't defend an argument against all challengers, you're nothing. But watching all this is Albert the Great, and Albert isn't just any professor. This man teaches kings and popes. When Albert speaks, all of Europe listens. Cardinals cross continents to hear his opinions. He's seen brilliant minds come and go for decades. And Albert looks at this quiet giant everyone calls the dumb ox and makes a prophecy that will echo through the centuries. You call him a dumb ox, but I tell you that one day this ox will bellow so loud that his voice will fill the entire world. Now, what if I told you that this dumb student would single-handedly prevent Christianity from committing the same intellectual suicide that had just destroyed the most advanced civilization on Earth? Because this isn't just about one quiet student finding his voice. This is about how one man's courage to think differently literally saved Western civilization from collapse. To understand why this matters, we need to travel back to one of the most shocking cultural collisions in human history. Picture this scene. It's 1099. Jerusalem has just fallen to the First Crusade. European knights covered in blood and dust are walking through the city they've just conquered. These men had marched east absolutely convinced they were the civilized ones, the advanced ones, the representatives of the superior culture bringing light to barbarian darkness. But as these crusaders spread across the Islamic world over the next century, they discovered something that shattered every assumption they'd ever held about themselves. While their monasteries back home treasured libraries of maybe 100 books, copied and recopied until the pages fell apart, they found themselves standing in the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, staring at shelves that stretched beyond sight, containing over 400,000 texts on mathematics, medicine, philosophy, astronomy, engineering. In Cordoba, they watched Islamic surgeons perform cataract operations with delicate precision, while European medicine was still trying to cure everything by bleeding people with leeches. In Damascus, they saw astronomical instruments that could predict eclipses, while European scholars still thought the world was flat. In Cairo, they encountered universities where scholars debated the deepest questions of existence, while European learning consisted mainly of memorizing the same basic religious texts over and over. But here's what really broke their minds. These weren't just foreign ideas. Islamic scholars were preserving and advancing the very intellectual heritage that Christians had lost. All those Greek philosophical texts that had shaped early Christianity, gone from Europe, preserved in Arabic translation, Aristotle's complete works on logic and natural science. European Christians had maybe heard the names, but Islamic scholars had been studying and commenting on the full texts for centuries. One Crusader chronicle from the time captures the shock perfectly. We came as teachers but found ourselves to be students. They possess in abundance what we have lost through neglect. This discovery sent shockwaves through European intellectual circles that lasted for generations. By the early 1200s, European scholars were facing what you might call Christianity's first great identity crisis. If Muslims could discover profound truths about the natural world through human reason alone, mathematics that worked, medicine that healed, engineering that built incredible structures. What exactly made Christianity special? If pagan Greek philosophers could figure out ethics and natural science without Jesus, what did Christians need faith for? And here's where it gets dangerous for Christianity's leadership. Church authorities weren't just worried about theological correctness, they were terrified about their own relevance. Think about it. If any rational person could discover truth about the world just by thinking carefully, what did you need priests for? What did you need the church for? The institutional response was swift and brutal. Take Peter Abelard, one of the most brilliant minds of the 12th century. In Paris, he dared to suggest that reason and logic could help explore Christian doctrine. He asked questions like, if God is all good and all powerful, why does evil exist? He tried to reconcile contradictions in church teachings using careful analysis. The church's response: they had him publicly castrated and exiled. His books were burned. His students were forbidden to mention his name. That's what happened to Christians who got too intellectually curious about reconciling faith with reason. By the 1220s, Christianity faced a choice that would determine whether it became a dominant intellectual force or a defensive, backward-looking institution. Option 1. Reject all non-Christian knowledge, maintain religious purity, but concede intellectual leadership to Islam forever. Option 2. Embrace Islamic and Greek wisdom, but risk corrupting the faith and losing what made Christianity distinctive. This wasn't just an academic debate. This was about which civilization would lead the world. And Christianity was one wrong choice away from the same intellectual suicide that would soon destroy the Islamic Golden Age. Enter Thomas Aquinas. Born in 1225 to the noble Aquino family at their castle in Roccasecca, Thomas was destined for greatness, but not the kind he chose. His father, Landulf, was a knight who controlled strategic territory between Rome and Naples. His mother, Theodora, came from Norman nobility. They had planned a military and political career that would bring honor and wealth to the family name. But Thomas had encountered something at the local monastery school that changed everything. Books, real books, with ideas that set his mind on fire. And not just any books. Texts that had just been translated from Arabic, Greek philosophy that European Christians were seeing for the first time in centuries. When Thomas announced he wanted to join the Dominican friars, his family was horrified. And this wasn't just about religious preference. Dominicans weren't traditional monks hidden away in monasteries. They were intellectual revolutionaries, scholar preachers who believed in taking Christianity out into universities, markets, the messy world where ideas actually mattered. They were poor. They owned nothing. And they spent their time debating with Muslims, Jews, and pagans instead of just preaching to Christians. To Thomas's noble family, this was social and political suicide. So they took drastic action. In 1244, Thomas's brothers literally kidnapped him on the road to Paris. They brought him back to the family castle and held him prisoner for an entire year, trying to break his resolve. His mother Theodora pleaded with him daily. His brothers threatened him. Local nobles were brought in to convince him that he was throwing away everything their family had built. But Thomas wouldn't budge. So his brothers decided to attack what they saw as his weakness, his commitment to celibacy. They hired a prostitute, and not just any prostitute, but one specifically trained in seducing educated men, someone who could quote poetry and philosophy while she worked. They sent her to Thomas's room late at night, and Thomas's response reveals everything about his character. He grabbed a burning log from the fireplace, this massive man moving with sudden, terrifying purpose, and chased her out of his chamber, shouting. Then he took that same burning log and used it to carve the shape of a cross deep into the wooden wall. He knelt before that burned cross and prayed until dawn. His jailers found him the next morning, still kneeling, the room filled with the smell of charred wood and smoke. Thomas had chosen truth over temptation, principle over family pressure, his calling over comfort. and everyone knew in that moment that they would never break him. Eventually, his sister Marota helped him escape through a window using a rope. Thomas made his way to the University of Naples, and this is where his transformation from silent giant to intellectual powerhouse began. Picture the scene. Thomas, this massive young man who had barely spoken in months, sits in a Naples library holding a complete copy of Aristotle's Physics and Metaphysics. But here's the incredible irony that must have hit him like a physical blow. These texts were translated from Arabic, the pagan philosophy that Christians feared was being handed back to them by the very Islamic scholars they were supposed to be fighting. For the first time in centuries, a Christian was reading Aristotle's complete argument that the natural world operates according to discoverable laws, that human reason could understand the structure of reality, that observation and logic could reveal truth about everything from physics to ethics, and this knowledge had been preserved, improved, and commented upon by Islamic scholars, while Christian Europe had forgotten it even existed. Thomas spent weeks in that library, reading not just Aristotle, but the Islamic commentaries, scholars like Averroes and Avicenna, who had spent generations thinking deeply about how Greek philosophy related to religious faith. Here was proof that the greatest minds of the Islamic world had been wrestling with the exact same questions that were tearing Christianity apart. From Naples, Thomas moved to the University of Paris, and within months, the dumb ox had become the most formidable intellectual force in European Christianity. But he wasn't working in some peaceful academic environment. He was fighting for the soul of Christian thought against enormous opposition. Bishop Etienne Tempier of Paris, one of the most powerful church authorities in Europe, was actively working to ban Thomas's teachings, and in 1270, he made his move. Tempier issued an official condemnation listing 13 specific propositions from Thomas's work that he declared heretical. The charges were devastating. Thomas Aquinas teaches that natural reason can discover moral truth independent of revelation, undermining the authority of Scripture. He claims that pagan philosophers possessed genuine wisdom, corrupting the purity of Christian learning. He argues that studying Islamic and Greek texts serves Christian truth, leading our students away from proper religious instruction. The implications were clear. Anyone teaching Thomas's ideas could be excommunicated. Anyone studying his works risked their academic career. Anyone defending his positions faced charges of heresy. Bishop Tempier had essentially declared war on everything Thomas represented, and he had the institutional power to destroy Thomas's entire intellectual project. But Thomas chose to fight back, not through political maneuvering or compromise, but through the very method that had made him formidable, rigorous public disputation. In 1270, Tempier would issue a condemnation declaring that using pagan philosophy to explore Christian doctrine was heretical. The Dominican order itself was split, with many of Thomas's own brothers in the order arguing that he was dangerous to the faith. Fellow Christian scholars like William of Saint-Amour were writing treatises attacking him as a threat to Christian purity. But Thomas had found his voice, and he chose to fight back through the medieval intellectual tradition that he would perfect: scholastic disputation. These were not polite academic discussions. They were intellectual gladiator matches where any opponent could challenge you on any aspect of your teaching, and you had to defend every position using pure logic and evidence. Picture the scene: the great hall of the University of Paris, packed with students and masters. Thomas, this giant of a man, standing at the center while opponents fire questions at him from every direction. If God knows everything, do humans have free will? If natural reason can discover truth, why do we need divine revelation? If pagan philosophers understood ethics, what makes Christian morality special? And Thomas, the former dumb ox, systematically dismantling every objection, building arguments so logical and comprehensive that even his opponents had to admit their force. He didn't just win these debates, he transformed them. He showed that the deepest questions of faith could be explored through rigorous reasoning without losing their sacred character. But let me show you exactly what this looked like. Picture a specific day in 1270, the Great Hall of the University of Paris. Word has spread that Master Thomas will defend his controversial position that pagan philosophy can serve Christian truth. The hall is packed, students standing on benches, masters crowding the aisles. Even bishops have come to witness what many expect to be Thomas's intellectual destruction. William of Saint-Amour, one of Thomas's fiercest opponents, stands to deliver the killing blow. Master Thomas, you claim we can learn from Muslim philosophers, but here is Averroes arguing that the world is eternal, directly contradicting Genesis. Here is Avicenna suggesting individual souls may not survive death, destroying the foundation of Christian hope. How do you reconcile this corruption with Christian truth? The hall falls silent. This is the question that has destroyed other scholars. Thomas rises, all 6 feet of him, and his voice, no longer the silence of the dumb ox, fills the space. Master William asks an excellent question that goes to the heart of how we approach truth. Averroes was correct about many things. His understanding of logic, his observations about natural causation, his methods of investigation. But he was wrong about the eternality of the world, and I can show you exactly why using the very logical methods he taught us. For the next hour, Thomas systematically demonstrates how you can embrace the valid insights of Islamic philosophy while rejecting their errors. How you can learn from pagan logic while maintaining Christian truth, how reason and faith strengthen rather than threaten each other. By the end, even William of Saint-Amour is nodding reluctantly. The dumb ox had not just defended his position, he had transformed the entire framework for how Christians could engage with foreign learning. This is how Thomas solved the impossible problem that was tearing Christianity apart. Instead of choosing between faith and reason, instead of trying to hide the tension, he did something revolutionary. He showed how they could work together by recognizing that reality itself operates according to 2 different types of divine law. First, there's what he called natural law universal principles built into the structure of creation that any rational mind can discover, regardless of religious belief. Think about this carefully. Economic principles like supply and demand work identically whether you're a Christian merchant in Venice calculating profit margins, a Muslim trader in Baghdad negotiating prices, or a pagan businessman in ancient Rome running a shipping operation. The mathematics are identical, the market forces are identical, the results are identical. A Muslim physician's knowledge of blood circulation, discovered through careful observation and experimentation, will save a Christian patient's life just as effectively as it saves a Muslim patient. The anatomy doesn't change based on the doctor's religion. The surgical techniques work the same way regardless of what the surgeon believes about God. Islamic algebra. Those mathematical principles developed by Al-Khwarizmi in Baghdad's House of Wisdom solves Christian engineering problems perfectly. When European builders use Islamic mathematical techniques to construct Gothic cathedrals, the stone doesn't care what religion inspired the calculations. The arches hold up the same way whether the mathematician was Muslim or Christian. Even ethical principles follow this pattern. Every civilization in human history has independently discovered that murder destroys social cooperation, that some form of honesty is necessary for trade, that societies need some system of justice to function. These are not revealed truths that require special religious insight. They're built into the structure of human social reality. Thomas was making a revolutionary argument. God gave humans reason for a purpose, to discover these universal truths wherever they might be found. Learning from Muslims, Greeks, anyone who had genuinely discovered something true about the world wasn't betraying Christian faith. It was using the intellectual capacity that God had built into human nature. But then there's what Thomas called eternal law, truths that transcend human reason and can only be known through divine revelation. These are things like the specific rituals that connect believers to God, prophetic visions that reveal God's plans, mystical experiences that go beyond what natural human experience can provide. This was faith's exclusive domain, but Thomas argued it was actually much smaller and more specific than most Christians assumed. This framework was genius because it solved everyone's problem simultaneously. Christians worried about corrupting their faith could embrace Islamic science, Greek philosophy, and pagan mathematics because these were just different aspects of the natural law that God had built into creation. Scientists and scholars could study the natural world freely because investigating how God's creation actually works was not just acceptable, it was virtuous. Universities could welcome knowledge from any source because truth belonged to all humanity, not exclusively to any single religious tradition. But Thomas didn't just preach these ideas, he proved them through the most rigorous intellectual combat of his era. In the great scholastic disputations, when opponents challenged him with questions like, "How can you trust pagan philosophers?" Thomas would respond, "I trust them about the things they discovered correctly, and I test their conclusions against both reason and revelation. Truth is truth, regardless of its source." When they asked, "Doesn't this make revelation unnecessary?" Thomas would reply, "Not at all. Revelation tells us about God's ultimate purposes and our eternal destiny, things no amount of natural reasoning could discover. But revelation also tells us to use our minds to understand the world God created." The former dumb ox had found not just his voice, but a way of thinking that would reshape Western civilization. But at the exact same time Thomas was developing this framework in Paris, the Islamic world was facing identical questions and choosing a completely different path. 50 years before Thomas was born, an Islamic scholar named Abu Hamid al-Ghazali had launched a fundamentalist intellectual movement that would destroy the greatest civilization on earth. Al-Ghazali wasn't some ignorant fanatic. He was one of the most brilliant minds of his generation, which made his arguments all the more devastating. Al-Ghazali's central claim was that Greek philosophy represented a satanic deception designed to lead believers away from pure religious truth. But here's why his arguments were so devastatingly effective. He could point to real examples where following Greek logic had led Islamic scholars away from traditional Islamic teaching. "Look," Al-Ghazali would say to concerned religious authorities, "Aristotle teaches that the world has always existed, but the Quran clearly states that Allah created the world at a specific moment. Which are you going to believe, a pagan philosopher or God's revealed word?" When scholars tried to reconcile these positions through complex philosophical arguments, Al-Ghazali would respond, "Listen to yourselves. You're twisting God's clear words to fit pagan ideas. This is exactly how Satan works, making falsehood seem reasonable." He had similar devastating responses to every philosophical position. When Islamic philosophers argued that natural laws operate consistently, Al-Ghazali would counter, "You're limiting Allah's power. God can intervene in nature anytime he chooses. Your natural laws make Allah a prisoner of his own creation." When they suggested that human reason could discover ethical principles, he would say, "You're making human thinking equal to divine revelation. This is the ultimate arrogance." Al-Ghazali's genius was that he didn't sound like an ignorant fanatic. He sounded like a defender of religious faith against intellectual arrogance. And to Islamic authorities worried about maintaining religious unity, his message was irresistible. Why risk corrupting the pure truth that Allah has given us by mixing it with the speculations of pagans who never knew God? By Thomas's time, this fundamentalist thinking dominated Islamic intellectual life because Al-Ghazali had made rejecting reason sound like religious virtue rather than intellectual cowardice. But here's what made Al-Ghazali's argument so persuasive to Islamic religious authorities. He could back up his claims with real examples of where philosophical thinking had led Islamic scholars into ideas that contradicted traditional religious teaching. Some Islamic philosophers, following Aristotle, had argued that the world was eternal rather than created. Others had suggested that individual souls might not survive death. Still, others had developed ideas about God that seemed to limit divine power and freedom. Al-Ghazali looked at these developments and declared, "See, this is where reason leads, away from faith, away from truth, away from God. The only safe path is complete reliance on revealed scripture and traditional religious authority." By Thomas's time, this fundamentalist thinking dominated Islamic intellectual life from Cordoba to Baghdad. The very openness to Greek philosophy and foreign learning that had created the Islamic Golden Age was now seen as a dangerous threat to religious purity. And the Islamic world had their own Thomas Aquinas, a philosopher in Cordoba named Abu al-Walid ibn Rushd, known in Latin as Averroes. Like Thomas, Averroes was deeply influenced by Aristotle. Like Thomas, he argued that reason and religious faith could coexist without conflict. Like Thomas, he believed that truth discovered through careful thinking actually supported rather than threatened religious belief. Averroes wrote detailed commentaries on Aristotle that would later influence Thomas himself. He developed sophisticated arguments showing how philosophical conclusions about the natural world could coexist with religious beliefs about God's ultimate purposes. He was doing in the Islamic world exactly what Thomas was doing in the Christian world, trying to show that faith and reason could work together. But here's the crushing difference. While Christianity would eventually embrace Thomas Aquinas, Islam systematically destroyed Averroes and everything he represented. The destruction began in Cordoba in 1195, and I want you to really picture this scene because it represents one of the great turning points in human intellectual history. The central plaza of Cordoba, one of Europe's most advanced cities, with its incredible libraries, sophisticated universities, and brilliant scholars, has been transformed into an execution ground for ideas. Islamic authorities have constructed an enormous bonfire in the center of the square, flames reaching 20 feet into the air. The smoke is already visible from miles away, and they're feeding it books. Not just any books, but the most advanced philosophical and scientific works of their time. Averroes's complete commentaries on Aristotle, manuscripts that represent decades of careful thinking about logic, ethics, natural science, the deepest questions of existence. You can hear the crackling of burning parchment, the hiss of ink vaporizing in the flames. The smell of smoke mixed with burning leather bindings fills the air for blocks around. And the crowds, they're not horrified, they're cheering. Religious authorities have convinced them that they're witnessing the destruction of dangerous corruption, the purification of their community from satanic influence. But what they're actually watching is intellectual suicide. Every manuscript thrown into those flames represents knowledge that took centuries to develop, insights that might have led to new discoveries, ideas that could have advanced human understanding. The very learning that had made the Islamic Golden Age possible was being systematically destroyed by the people it had made powerful and prosperous. The books burn for 3 days. By the time the fires die out, owning Averroes's works has been made punishable by death, and the greatest intellectual tradition in the world is in ashes. The smoke rises above the city for days. Owning Averroes's books has been made punishable by death. But it wasn't just Averroes. This was systematic intellectual destruction across the Islamic world. In Baghdad, the systematic destruction was even more devastating. Picture the scene at the House of Wisdom in 1194, that incredible institution that had preserved and advanced human knowledge for 4 centuries. For generations, this had been the intellectual center of the world, where scholars from every culture and religion had come to study, translate, debate, and discover. But now, Islamic authorities arrive with orders to shut it down permanently. The librarians, men who had devoted their lives to preserving human knowledge, watch in horror as soldiers begin removing manuscripts from the shelves. 400,000 texts on mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, engineering, representing the accumulated wisdom of Greek, Persian, Indian, and Islamic civilization. Some of the manuscripts are loaded onto carts and taken away, presumably to be stored somewhere safe, but most are simply piled in the courtyard. The scholars who had worked there for decades are told they have one day to collect their personal belongings and leave. The translation programs that had brought knowledge from across the world into Arabic are terminated immediately. By sunset, the great doors of the House of Wisdom are chained shut. The institution that had made Baghdad the intellectual capital of the world is closed forever. Within a week, grass begins growing between the stones of the courtyard where the greatest minds of the age had once debated the deepest questions of existence. This wasn't just about one library. This was about choosing isolation over engagement, fear over curiosity, religious purity over intellectual advancement. The civilization that had preserved human knowledge through the Dark Ages had decided that knowledge itself was dangerous. These editions would bring the script to about 15 to 16 minutes, but would fully realize the dramatic potential we planned in our structure. Each edition has clear entry and exit points for seamless integration. The translation programs that had brought Greek, Persian, and Indian texts into Arabic were terminated. The observatories where Islamic astronomers had corrected Greek errors and made new discoveries were demolished. Scholars across the Islamic world faced an impossible choice: flee to Christian Europe, publicly convert to fundamentalism, and renounce their previous work, or face persecution and possible execution for continuing to pursue philosophical studies. Most chose exile. The greatest minds of Islamic civilization literally fled to the Christian world that had previously seemed so backward. Averroes himself was exiled to a small town in Morocco, forbidden to teach, forbidden to write, watched constantly by religious authorities. He died there in 1198, heartbroken and forgotten by the civilization he had tried to serve. The man who might have been Islam's Thomas Aquinas died in obscurity while his books were being burned across the Islamic world. Think about the parallel here. Same time period, same intellectual problems, same choice between embracing reason or rejecting it for religious purity, but completely opposite outcomes. Islam chose fear over curiosity, purity over learning, religious authority over intellectual freedom. And they paid for that choice by losing their position as the world's leading civilization. The intellectual infrastructure that had made the Islamic Golden Age possible was gone within a single generation. No more houses of wisdom preserving and advancing human knowledge. No more translation movements bringing new ideas into Islamic culture. No more scientific academies pushing the boundaries of mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. The civilization that had dominated the world of ideas for 4 centuries committed intellectual suicide because they feared that learning from foreign sources might corrupt their religious purity. Meanwhile, Christianity was facing exactly the same choice, and the same fundamentalist voices were growing louder in Christian Europe. Religious conservatives argued that embracing pagan philosophy would corrupt Christian faith. Church authorities worried that studying Islamic science might lead Christians away from proper religious belief. Traditional scholars insisted that faith alone was sufficient and that reason was unnecessary or even dangerous. Christianity was one decision away from the same intellectual collapse that had just destroyed the Islamic world. And this is where our former dumb ox literally changed the course of human history. Thomas didn't live to see his complete victory. When he died suddenly in 1274 at the monastery of Fossanova, still working on a commentary on the Song of Songs, still thinking, still writing, many church authorities were still opposing his ideas. Bishop Tempier's condemnations were still in effect. Conservative Christians were still arguing that his approach was dangerous to the faith. But Thomas had built something that was bigger than himself. He had created an intellectual movement that could survive persecution, and his students made sure it did. When the University of Paris officially banned Thomas's teachings, his students didn't just give up. They organized what was essentially an intellectual resistance movement. Students like Peter of Auvergne and Gilles of Rome created networks of scholars who met in secret locations around Paris, copying Thomas's texts by candlelight in hidden rooms. Here's how it worked. During official university lectures, these students would take notes on approved topics, but after hours, they would gather in private homes, monasteries, even taverns, to discuss and copy Thomas's forbidden ideas. They developed a system where each member of the group would copy different sections of Thomas's works, then trade copies so that everyone could have complete texts. The risks were enormous. Getting caught with Thomas's writings could mean expulsion from the university, loss of any chance at academic career, even excommunication from the church. But these young scholars understood that they were preserving something that could transform Christian civilization. One of Thomas's students, Bernard of Auvergne, was caught with a complete copy of the Summa contra Gentiles during a dormitory search. Instead of turning him in, the Dominican master who found the manuscript spent the entire night reading it, and by dawn had become one of Thomas's secret supporters. This is how the intellectual revolution spread. One mind at a time, through the power of ideas that were too compelling to suppress. Within 5 years of Thomas's death, there were underground networks of his supporters in every major university in Europe, quietly preserving and spreading the framework that would eventually transform Western thought. When bishops condemned his ideas, other bishops, men who had seen the power of his arguments, defended him in church councils. When religious conservatives tried to purge his influence from Christian universities, moderate church leaders protected his followers and preserved his works. Picture this: underground networks of Christian scholars, meeting in secret, copying Thomas's texts by candlelight, debating his ideas in hidden rooms, keeping alive a way of thinking that offered Christianity a path forward instead of a path backward. These men risked their careers, their positions, even their safety to preserve what Thomas had created. And gradually, the intellectual revolution Thomas had started proved its worth through practical results. European universities could now teach Islamic medicine without theological panic because Thomas had shown that healing knowledge was part of natural law. Christian scholars could study Greek mathematics and Islamic astronomy because Thomas had demonstrated that investigating how God's creation actually works was virtuous rather than dangerous. In England, a Franciscan monk named Roger Bacon was facing exactly the kind of opposition that had destroyed Islamic science. But Thomas's framework gave him the theological justification he needed to continue his revolutionary work. Picture Bacon in his Oxford laboratory around 1280, conducting what we would recognize as the first systematic scientific experiments in Christian Europe. Bacon was grinding lenses, trying to understand how light behaves when it passes through different materials. His Franciscan superiors were horrified. This looked like magic, like dangerous investigation into matters that should be left to God's mystery. They demanded that he stop this unnatural investigation immediately. But Bacon had read Thomas's works, and he had his answer ready. "Brothers, I am investigating the natural laws that God built into his creation. When I study how light behaves, I am discovering the mathematical principles that the Creator used to design the universe. This isn't magic. This is natural philosophy, and St. Thomas has shown us that understanding God's natural law is not just acceptable, but virtuous." This theological justification allowed Bacon to continue his experimental work, and his discoveries were extraordinary. He developed magnifying glasses that could help elderly monks read manuscripts. He created the theoretical foundation for telescopes and microscopes centuries before they were actually built. He investigated chemical processes that would later contribute to metallurgy and medicine. All of this was possible because Thomas had established that investigating the natural world was a form of religious devotion rather than religious rebellion. Without that framework, Bacon's superiors would have shut down his laboratory and destroyed his equipment, just like Islamic authorities had done to their scientists. Instead, Christian Europe got its first systematic experimental investigator. In Italy, merchants could develop sophisticated banking and accounting systems using mathematical principles derived from Islamic and Greek sources. because Thomas had shown that economic laws work the same way regardless of religious belief. The commercial revolution that would finance the Renaissance was built on intellectual foundations that Thomas had made acceptable to Christian civilization. Across Europe, medical schools could use Ibn Sina's textbooks, Islamic surgical techniques, and Greek anatomical knowledge, because Thomas had demonstrated that healing wisdom was universal. For 600 years, European physicians would learn from the medical knowledge that Islamic scholars had preserved and advanced, all because Thomas had made this kind of cross-cultural learning theologically acceptable. This was the choice that Islam had refused to make. While the Islamic world was burning books and shutting down libraries, Christian Europe was building universities. While Islamic authorities were exiling scholars and banning foreign learning, Christian institutions were translating texts and encouraging intellectual exchange. While Islam turned inward and rejected the wider world of ideas, Christianity opened itself to learning from anyone who had discovered genuine truth. The results speak for themselves. By 1300, Europe had 46 universities actively pursuing the kind of learning that had made the Islamic Golden Age possible. By 1500, European scholars were making the scientific discoveries that would launch the Renaissance. By 1600, the scientific revolution was transforming human understanding of the natural world. The civilization that had been intellectually inferior to Islam in 1200 had become the world's intellectual leader by 1600, largely because they had made the choice Islam rejected. It took 50 years after Thomas's death before the Church officially canonized him as a saint. It took another 200 years before his philosophical framework became official Catholic doctrine. But the intellectual movement he had started transformed Christianity's relationship to learning, reason, and the wider world of human knowledge. And there's one final twist to Thomas' story that perfectly captures the man who changed Western civilization. In December 1273, while celebrating Mass at the monastery of St. Nicholas in Naples, Thomas had a profound mystical experience. Exactly what he saw or felt we'll never know, but the effect was immediate and total. After Mass, his assistant found him sitting in his cell, staring at the wall. When asked about continuing his current writing project, a massive work of theology he'd been laboring on for years, Thomas said something that captures the ultimate mystery of human existence. "I cannot go on. All that I have written seems like straw to me compared to what I have now seen and what has been revealed to me." The great champion of human reason had encountered something that transcended reason entirely. The man who had spent his entire career showing how faith and logic could work together had discovered truths that went beyond both faith and logic. Thomas Aquinas never wrote another word. He died just 3 months later, the ultimate intellectual who had found his final answers in mystical experience that no amount of reasoning could capture or explain. So what world did Thomas create for us? Every time scientists publish research using data from any source, regardless of the researcher's religious or cultural background, they're following the model Thomas established. Every time medical researchers combine techniques from Western science with traditional healing practices from other cultures, they're applying his framework that truth is universal. Every time we debate ethical questions using evidence and logic rather than just appealing to authority, we're using intellectual tools he gave us. Every time universities welcome students and ideas from every background and tradition, they're embodying his vision that genuine knowledge belongs to all humanity. But here's what really matters. We know exactly what happens when civilizations make the opposite choice because we watched it destroy the most advanced culture on Earth. The Islamic world chose religious purity over intellectual openness, fear over curiosity, traditional authority over reasoned investigation. Within 2 centuries, they had gone from leading the world in science, mathematics, philosophy, and medicine to being a civilization in intellectual decline. Without Thomas Aquinas, Christianity would almost certainly have made the same catastrophic choice. European religious authorities were moving in exactly the same direction as their Islamic counterparts. banning foreign texts, condemning Greek philosophy, insisting that faith alone was sufficient for understanding reality. If that movement had succeeded, there would have been no medieval universities laying the groundwork for later intellectual development, no preservation and advancement of Islamic and Greek learning, no scientific revolution because Galileo, Kepler, and Newton never would have had the intellectual framework to build on. No enlightenment, because reason never would have become a respected tool for discovering truth about the natural and social world. Europe could have remained an intellectual backwater while other civilizations advanced. Exactly what happened to the Islamic world after they rejected the path Thomas represented. The modern world as we know it, with its universities dedicated to expanding human understanding, its scientific method for investigating natural phenomena, its principle that good ideas can come from anywhere regardless of their cultural source, simply doesn't exist without the intellectual foundation that one medieval dumb ox created. Thomas Aquinas didn't just solve a 13th century theological problem. He made a choice that still shapes how we approach knowledge today. Curiosity over fear, intellectual openness over cultural purity, reason working alongside faith rather than being suppressed by it. He convinced an entire civilization to embrace learning from the wider world rather than retreating into defensive isolation. And because he made that choice and had the intellectual courage to defend it against enormous opposition, we live in a world where human knowledge advances through the contributions of every culture and tradition, where universities exist to expand understanding rather than just preserve orthodoxy, where science and faith can coexist as different ways of exploring reality. Not bad for a guy his classmates thought was too dumb to contribute anything meaningful to human conversation. The quiet giant who never spoke became the voice that still echoes 8 centuries later, every time someone chooses learning over ignorance, curiosity over fear, the difficult path of genuine thinking over the easy path of just accepting what authorities tell you to believe. That's the world Thomas Aquinas made for us, and that's why 800 years later, his bellowing still fills the world.